Well, let's talk about blind trust, 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 blind trust for an individual that has assets in a blind trust. When a public officer has a blind trust.
Why is Leslie Church so concerned about talking about blind trusts? Thanks to our friends over at Democracy Watch, we know why. Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you breaking news from our friends at Democracy Watch. As some of you know, the Standing Committee on Privacy and Ethics has been performing an in-depth, months-long study into Mark Carney, his conflicts of interest, and the Conflict of Interest Act itself. The goal of that study was to determine the problems posed by not only Mark Carney's conflicts of interest, but the loopholes in the Act itself, and seek to rectify them. Duff Conacher of Democracy Watch has made an important discovery that could very well taint the very study about conflicts of interest as a result of a conflict of interest. What do I mean? Let's take a look.
We are studying the Conflict of Interest Act as it relates to designated public office holders, and perhaps the recommendations will come in the response. Recommendations of the committee and the report will come from some of the responses that Mr. Ward gives to Mr. Cooper's questions. Mr. Cooper, you have 3 minutes and 49 seconds to continue your questioning. Go ahead.
On page 12 of your report, there is reference to Brookfield's tax gap over the last 5 years between 2017 and 2021. Just so that I'm clear on what a tax gap means, it is measuring the difference between taxes actually paid and taxes that would have been paid if the statutory Canadian tax rate had been applied to profits reaped. Do I have that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And according to your analysis, or the analysis cited in your report, Brookfield's tax gap in just 5 years between 2017 to 2021 was over $6.5 billion. Is that right?
That's correct, and that was based on research done by the Canadians for Tax Fairness and by some analysis from the Toronto Star as well.
So it would be fair to say that the extent of Brookfield's tax avoidance, taxes that it should have otherwise paid in Canada in just 5 years, was over $6.5 billion.
Yes, I mean, the tax gap is looking at the statutory rate, and there are some reasons why legitimate reasons why companies pay below that, but that's an indication of a major underpayment of taxes that, in the spirit of the law, should have been paid in Canada to finance public services in Canada.
Yeah, I'd say $6.5 billion is a lot of money. Would it be fair to say that Brookfield is Canada's largest tax dodger amongst corporations?
It has been labeled as such, and if it's not the largest, it's clearly in the very top tier.
The witness, if he can just elaborate on why it is in his submissions that a blind trust is not an appropriate mechanism.
In 45 seconds, sir.
Well, I think because there's still the ability to profit from something in a blind trust, even if you don't know the details of what's going on, you're benefiting from the actions that might be taken by somebody else on your behalf.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper and Mr. Ward. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Church from the Liberal Party for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Ms. Church.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so before we get to anything, and I know you are interested as to where this is going, but to lay out the context here, Mr. Ward has presented a report that is talking about Brookfield. It's talking about the tax gap that it actually has. And at the end, he talked about conflict of interest and what was in a blind trust. Duff Conacher has been in committee talking about how you can still benefit from a blind trust while in office, even though it's in a quote-unquote blind trust. You still know what was in there, and you can still benefit based on what was in there. So This is a witness that is obviously presenting problems for Mark Carney, and it's presenting problems for the Liberals. So Leslie Church is coming in on the heels of Michael Cooper and his questioning of Mr. Ward and his statements. And this is the stance that she takes.
Mr. Ward, so you started off your remarks by saying that you're not an expert on Canada's Conflict of Interest Act. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you know who is covered by Canada's Conflict of Interest Act?
I'm assuming that it relates to public officials, but I have not read the act. I am an expert on tax havens and other using various schemes to avoid tax.
So you would agree then that it doesn't cover corporations, that it's not the intent of the act? The intent of the act is to cover public office holders?
I do not have the knowledge to respond to that adequately.
Well, let's talk about blind trust then, if you're not familiar with the act itself. Are you aware that investments that are entered into a blind trust are fully disclosed before they're put into a blind trust by a public office holder?
That the investments are disclosed before entering into a blind trust?
Correct.
Yes.
So those, just for the sake of transparency, those assets then are known. The public office holder then puts them into a blind trust so that from that point forward, they no longer have control over those assets. Correct?
Right.
That's right. So a public office holder then would have no awareness over the performance or even the composition of the assets that were in a blind trust once that trust is established. Correct?
Yes, but they would benefit from actions taken by others on their behalf in profits that might be derived
Now,
into that.
how
from
would
the
they
blind
know
trust.
that if they didn't know what the composition of the blind trust was?
Well, I think there's an example here that is very relevant south of Canada with the situation of the Trump administration profiting from deals that are being constructed by his children. Is that that's not a blind trust situation?
But you understand the actual responsibilities of the trustee of a blind trust, which is that they have the authority, fiduciary authority over the trust and the assets in that trust to make changes to it, to sell those assets, that a person who establishes a trust actually is prevented under Canadian conflict of interest legislation from providing direction to the trustee. So the public office holder who establishes the trust actually does not have control, has not provided any guidance to the trustee, and has no awareness as to the composition of that trust following its establishment. You're aware of that in the Canadian context?
I am aware of that in the Canadian context. However, if you look at the case of big four accounting firms who also have created legal situations where information is not supposed to transfer from one part of the business to another, it has. And so I do
Mr. Ward,
think
what
that
relevance does that have to the Canadian Conflict of Interest Act that covers public office holders in the Canadian Parliament?
it's a parallel situation in which rules that exist are abused because there's information.
Is there an
transferred
ethics
between
commissioner
trustees.
that is governing private sector blind trusts or whatever situation it is you're talking about in big accounting firms? Is there a publicly funded, determined ethics commissioner in office responsible for oversight in those cases?
In some jurisdictions, yes.
In Canada?
I'm not familiar with the Canadian law.
No, there is not. There is no public ethics commissioner that oversees those. That is a role of Parliament. When a public officer has a blind trust, is that public office holder shielded from tax for any gains or losses that may be incurred of the assets in that trust?
Well, it depends on how the investments in the blind trust are structured, doesn't it?
Well, I think the answer there is no, that tax law actually applies to the assets that are controlled by a blind trust, and it is the fiduciary, the trustee in this case, that is actually responsible for the tax management of those assets. Is that not correct?
There are huge amounts of loopholes, which you've just been discussing, that are in the tax law that allow individuals and corporations to significantly reduce their tax obligations under legal provisions in the law that we've just been discussing.
Now,
are
Mr. Ward,
clearly,
I'm
in my
sure that
view,
you can help me
immoral.
distinguish between what is general tax law or international tax law and what I'm asking you, which is for an individual that has assets in a blind trust, those assets are subject to tax law, yes or no?
Of course they're subject
Of course
to tax
they
law,
are subject to tax law.
But is the tax law an effective mechanism in order for them to pay the appropriate amount of tax?
But Mr. Ward, I don't want to seem too disagreeable with you.
Now, apologies for that lengthy exchange, but it's necessary. Why is Leslie Church so concerned about talking about blind trusts? At the time, many of us assumed that it was just because she was trying to protect Mark Carney, because he has these alleged blind trusts where he allegedly has no idea what's in them, despite the fact that he created the fund. And it would be kind of ridiculous to assume that the person that is managing said fund and overseeing it is going to make any changes at all to what Mark Carney actually set it up as, right? So that was the assumption that all of us were making on why Leslie Church came out so hard in this exchange and in other exchanges about blind trusts. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks to our friends over at Democracy Watch, we know why. Ladies and gentlemen, a press release was released today from Democracy Watch. Group highlights key facts and dirty dozen loopholes in second submission to House Ethics Committee's review of federal government ethics laws. And they go on to talk about some of the things that was actually released in the Democracy Watch press release. But they link to something else. This is what they link to. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Leslie Church, Member of Parliament, Conflicts of Interest Code of Members of the House of Commons, Parliamentary Secretary to the SOS for Labour, Seniors and Child and Youth, and to Minister of Jobs and Families, Persons with Disabilities. So she's part of Cabinet. She's a Parliamentary Secretary. Now, the summary of her profile. Ladies and gentlemen, now we know why Leslie Church was so annoyed that we were talking about blind trust, because she herself has a blind trust under the Conflict of Interest Act and administered at quote-unquote arm's length. But that's not all. Her spouse has a significant interest in Council Public Affairs Incorporated, a government relations firm in Toronto, Ontario. He's a director of that corporation in Toronto, Ontario, and as well as a board member of Government Relations Institute of Canada, Ottawa, Ontario, board member of the Toronto St. Paul's Electoral District Association of the Liberal Party of Canada. So, that's not surprising. This is the website for Council Public Affairs, and you can see that they specialized in government relations. Effective advocacy means delivering the right message to the right people at the right time. I wonder what those right people would mean. Our nationwide multi-partisan team of experienced consultants are experts in navigating Canada's dynamic political landscape. With extensive experience working for and with municipal, provincial, and federal governments at the most senior levels, our team knows how to align your goals with government priorities. Can you see why this is a problem, folks? You have Leslie Church, who is as smug can be, and she is sitting there trying to lecture other people on conflicts of interest when she is literally participating in a study on conflicts of interest that could have dramatic changes for parliamentarians that have blind trusts, that have conflict of interest, that have ethics screens. When she herself has an ethics screen, she herself has a blind trust. So it's literally within her interest to ensure that this report skews away from punishing anybody with a blind trust or taking on any of the suggestions that were brought up at committee by Democracy Watch and others that seek to possibly eliminate blind trusts for people that are in government. It's literally a conflict of interest for her to be participating in the conflict of interest study. I'd say you can't make this stuff up. I'd say you would be shocked to hear this, but I don't think anybody is shocked anymore. Now, this is where it gets crazy, because the discussion of the ethics screen and the measures that she's taking in order to avoid any conflict of interest is actually in her public disclosure. Check it out. Agreed compliance measures. Conflict of interest screens are preventative compliance measures agreed upon pursuant to Section 29 of the Conflict of Interest Act by a public office holder and the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner to assist public office holders in avoiding conflicts of interest. Screens also seek to minimize the possibility of conflicts arising between the public duties of the public office holder and their private interests or those of their relatives and friends. The Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner and I, that's Leslie, agreed that a conflict of interest screen is an appropriate compliance measure for me, aimed at preventing any opportunity to further the private interests of my relative, Mr. Seamus Murphy, managing partner at Council Public Affairs, or to give preferential treatment to Council as a reporting public office holder. Accordingly, I have agreed to recuse myself from any discussion or decision in relation to Council. I understand that recusal means that I must remove myself from the room, physically or virtually, as the case may be. I also agree not to have any communication with government officials in relation to any matter or decision-making process which I or the screen administrator know or reasonably should know to affect my relative's private interest. This screen is co-administered by my Director of Parliamentary Affairs, the person that reports to her, and the Parliamentary Secretary Assistant in the Minister's office to ensure that I am neither made aware of nor participate in any official matters or decision-making processes involving my relative's private interests, unless the interest relates to a decision or matter that is of general application. I will participate in decisions or matters of general application and those that may affect my relative's private interests as a member of a broad class of persons unless those interests are disproportionate to the other members of the class. Now, this is just in relation, this ethics screen, in relation to her spouse. But the Conflict of Interest Act also is in relation to any of the MPs themselves. So how can you be expected to be participating in a discussion on the Conflict of Interest Act when it relates specifically to blind trusts when you yourself have a blind trust? Now, in order to be fair, we checked John Brassard, Michael Barrett, Michael Cooper, Gabriel Hardy, Linda Lapointe, and the other Liberals on this committee. None of them have a blind trust. None of them have an ethics screen. Only Leslie Church does. So that's in fairness. Because if you're going to call it a conflict of interest, you have to call it on everybody else. But the main issue is that Leslie Church, she's not just any MP. She's a parliamentary secretary. Okay? She is an extension of the government. She works with the minister. She works with departments. And she has a blind trust herself. She has an ethics screen herself. So when she's participating in a study where they're talking about proposals that may say, you know what, ethics screens aren't good enough. Blind trusts aren't good enough. And she's sitting there chastising people for talking about blind trusts, chastising people for talking about removing blind trusts and removing any sort of investments prior to taking public office. That's a problem. You're in a conflict of interest. So, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it going to be interesting if we end up seeing an investigation on the Ethics Committee for one of its own members violating the Conflict of Interest Act by discussing the Conflict of Interest Act?